We just heard some inklings. We heard about HPB, who's saying that she had struggles just like you and I do to make a living in this world. They went through the same processes that we went through, the same challenges. They are the same essence as we are. But unlike many of us, they devoted their lives to trying to put forth this message that we are great human beings. We have the potential within us that we don't even realize to become perfected. So this is a basic message of Theosophy. It lays out the framework, lays out the path that HPB and William Q. Judge passed on to us from the masters. And near the end of the life of current life of HPB and William Q. Judge, another student came on the scene, Robert Crosbie, who picked up the flag, really, of the Theosophical movement as HPV and Mr. Judge recorded it, and went through a lot of turmoil when newer people were coming on the scene, trying to replace rather than continue the basic message of Theosophy, involved in organizational matters, etc., when Mr. Crosbie thought that the basic message should be portrayed. Mr. Crosbie was characterized in many ways. One is the practical worker for humanity. This student just indicated he fought for a cause, not for a flag. He said loyalty to the cause itself is a great sifter. No, Mr. Crosbie was no believer in diluted theosophy. He understood that this basic message that the masses had laid out for us becomes convoluted as we pick and choose from this person and that person, etc., etc. He understood that you have to stay with this message, stay focused on it, keep looking for more of the same. If you become convinced that this is the message and becomes part of you, you continue to look for more of the same, and you don't go out in the world and here, there, and yonder trying to understand who said what about who. So he was no believer in diluted theosophy. It's a tough course, as those who have tried know it to be. He revived the original teachings passed on by HPV and Mr. Judge. When he came on the scene, the secret doctrine was basically going out of print. We had Isis Unveiled, which HPV wrote. It was completely gone out of print. And there was scrambling going on back and forth to try to come up with people's own versions of what theosophy should be. He was no different than any of us, as this sort of indicated. He was a businessman, called a humble foot soldier. He had undeviating devotion to the cause of theosophy. When asked what were the pitfalls, he quickly came up with personnel and thing successorship are the pitfalls. He said the secret path that their feet had trod, or this student is saying, the secret path that their feet had trod remained visibly present to Mr. Crosbie as to few others among many. So he stayed with the message. And what Mr. Crosbie said, he didn't really originate either. If we go back to the year 100 or 200, we see Plotinus saying the same kind of thing. He tried to downplay the personality side and focus on the message as he continued to pass it on, which we know today as the modern theosophical movement. Mr. Crosbie was known as a friendly philosopher because of the letters that he wrote and published in his book, The Friendly Philosopher, the one that was published on his behalf. He wrote, he did the answers to the questions on the ocean of theosophy. When Mr. Judge passed, he had done the first 7 chapters of the notes on the notes of the Bhagavad Gita. Mr. Crosbie picked up the ball there, and he did chapters 8 to 18, and they were fairly comprehensive notes very helpful in understanding the importance of the words in the Bhagavad Gita. He was the editor of the Theosophy magazine for many years. He was the editor of the Theosophical movement. He was the editor of Because for Children Who Ask Why. Born January 10, 1849, he was a Canadian, born in Montreal, and his parents were Scottish. They were connected with the Hudson Bay Company. From history, we are familiar with that company. And his mother was very devoted to social matters. He was raised a Presbyterian, and he was asked to join the church at age 16, but he still considered himself unfit, and he started probing into details with the church folks, and he started to doubt the church practices. He then determined to seek the truth, which he thought must be knowledge, and which was to be found in due course by seeking it. A few years later, he went into business, another manufacturing business in Montreal, married the daughter of his partner, and they worked in this business in Montreal for several years. His partner's wife died, and his partner became interested in spiritualism matters, etc. That was apparently a very big movement during the 1800s. And Mr. Crosbie looked into it, found nothing particularly attractive relative to that. He did hear about the psychic powers latent in man. He thought that was interesting. He always had a strong regard for the rights of others and always exercised a strong moral control over himself. A few years later, they had an opportunity to sell their business in Montreal, so he and his partner did that, and they moved to Boston and started another business very much like what they had in Montreal. And his partner heard about the establishment of the TS in Boston, and the words Theosophia caught Mr. Crosbie's eye, and he immediately thought that this must be what he was looking for. He went to the first meeting of the TS and immediately joined. Soon after that, Mr. Judge came to speak, and upon leaving the meeting back to his hotel, Mr. Judge called back to Mr. Crosbie, "Good night, Crosbie. I've got you on my list." This started an association which continued in a very deep way. Mr. Crosbie wrote to HPB at Mr. Judge's suggestion, and the bond was created. When the esoteric section was formed by the TS in October 1988 in Boston, Mr. Crosbie was one of the first members. He identified himself with the Zahn section and was for many years the devoted and close companion of William Q. Judge and the pupil of H.P. Blavatsky. HPB and Mr. Judge are the two pictures behind me here. And later, as they developed this association with each other, Mr. Judge would respond to people who were inquiring of him, folks from the New England states areas. He would respond, "Ask Crosbie. He thinks and acts as I do." After HPB's death, Mr. Judge put Crosbie in charge of the esoteric groups in the 7 New England states. In 1892, he'd had problems with his marriage before, especially when he got very involved in the Theosophical movement, and there was a legal separation between him and his wife. He sold his business, gave her the proceeds and the house, and moved on. Started a new business on his own. Of course, that ended the partnership, I guess, too, because his partner was the father of the daughter of the lady he was married to. So he continued with his work in the Boston area TS. He helped organize the 5th convention of the American section of the Theosophical Society, as well as the 8th convention in 1892 and then in 1895. And he was very involved in also publishing some literature relative to the 8th convention, including continuing on the words of HPB, who said, "The unity of the Theosophical movement does not depend upon the singleness of organizations, but upon the similarity of works and aspiration. And in this, we will keep the link unbroken." So he was working to continue the work that Mr. Judge and HPB was working at. He submitted a historical sketch of the TS also at the 8th convention. Continuing on, 1896, 1894 to 1896, it was a time of great trial. Mr. Judge had just been defending HPB relative to charges that were brought about her that were false. He was an attorney, so he was working through the court system on that. And HPB passed on, and then Mr. Judge started to be attacked because he was still trying to continue the basic message of theosophy, and we had those in the Theosophical Society who were trying to establish themselves as successors to HPB, and there was a lot of conflict going on. After Mr. Judge died, he was in New York. Mr. Crosbie was in Boston. Some people in New York went through Mr. Judge's papers and said that there was a Mrs. Tingley, who was supposed to be the successor to Mr. Judge to carry on the movement. Mr. Crosbie went along with that. He said he had no reason to doubt that that was the situation. He didn't see the papers. So he took up the banner in a close association with Mrs. Tingley. And the only one of the few articles he signed was in May 1896, when he wrote an article about Mr. Judge, a friend of old time and of the future. And he mentioned in this article a few things that this student is going to quote. "My first meeting with him changed the whole current of my life. I trusted him then, as I trust him now, and those whom he trusted. To me, it seems that trust is the bond that binds, that makes the strength of the movement, for it is of the heart." He went on to say his extraordinary power of organization, marvelous insight into the character and capacity of individuals, his ability of turning seeming evils into powerful goods. All those he said about Mr. Judge. So April 1896 and later, 1900, Mr. Crosbie married his second wife, Josephine Parsons, in Manchester, New Hampshire. Maybe she was a part of the Theosophical movement. Apparently she was. So this student struck this student that in 1900 she went with him to Point Loma